Happy New Year and welcome to the first episode of A Slice of Medieval for 2025. Kicking off the year is a wonderful first guest who's actually here for the third time. She's our first third-time returner is New York Times best-selling author Elizabeth Chadwick. Elizabeth's book, The Greatest Night, introduced many of us to the iconic William Marshall. In her latest book, The Royal Rebel, Elizabeth has ventured into the 14th century and the court of King Edward III, and a love triangle that must have been the talk of Europe at the time. Joan of Kent and her husbands, in inverted commas, Thomas Holland and William Montague. Welcome back, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I hadn't realised it was 3 times, but then Historical Novel Society, of course. So that's sort of a cheaty one.
It still counts.
Yes, it does. I've got the Triple Crown now.
And a great way to kick off a new year. So what made you want to write Joan of Kent's story, and why do you use the name Jeanette?
Right, well, she'd been on my radar a little bit just as a general knowledge thing for some time, but as well, coming off COVID and the big changes in society, it made me wonder about how a person living in that time, how they go on. You know, you've got a pandemic, you've got upheavals in society, you've got big changes coming through. And her marital story also interested me, and I began reading up, and I thought, this is an interesting tale. I mean, I know a couple of other authors may have covered her, but at the same time, one always brings one's own imagination and something different to each story for the readers. Why I called her Jeanette was because that was her name as a child, and as she grew up, she was given a silver cup by Prince Edward, the Black Prince, in, I think it was 1348, without fine-tuning the date, that was engraved with Jeanette on it. Now, he'd known her since he'd been born, and the fact that he called her this meant that this was indeed her name. It wasn't just a pet name that he would have engraved on a cup. It was how she was known by the people who knew her, and how she would have identified herself. So that's why she became Jeanette.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that, you know, this happens a lot nowadays, doesn't it? Somebody's name is Alfred or something, but they're called Bert or Harry or whatever in the family and friends and so on. So there's no reason why it shouldn't have happened in the Middle Ages as well.
It happened all the time in the Middle Ages, which is where we get some of our nicknames. You know, and it you know, Richard, and you think of Dickon.
Yeah,
It's there all the time when you tune into it. Jeanette is a diminutive of like Jean. I don't know when the actual pronunciation Joan came in. I confess to not knowing that historical fact.
No.
When I don't want to, you know, my accent, I could say it all wrong, you know, Jeanette, but it would be EAN.
Yeah, I think it would have been Jeanne originally, like Jeanne d'Arc.
Yeah. But when did it become Joan?
Yeah.
You know,
it's impossible, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Speech is something which was so different in the various times in the Middle Ages anyway. So for us to pretend to produce it is a nonsense, really, isn't it?
Yes, but I mean, the sort of underlying fact of why I called her that name was this silver cup given to her by a close friend with that name on it, and she'd lived at court for a lot of her life. So this was why I did it.
Yeah, it's a good indication that that's what they called her. I mean, we have it a lot. I've noticed a lot especially in the 2 centuries after the post-conquest, because things are written in Latin and French.
Yeah.
you get different names for the same person,
Yes.
and you think you're writing about three people, and it's just one person.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's like, I suppose, the name Matilda. I mean, I called William Marshall's daughter. And again, I'm just saying it phonetically, Mahelt. It's probably Malt or Mold. And nobody would have been known as Matilda then, because it's the Latin form. Maud as an English name didn't come in until Joan of Kent's time, or just a little earlier.
Yeah.
So again, we're just using it as a convenient modern handle,
Yeah.
really.
And in the French, it would have been Mathilde.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
It's just, you've got to pick a name and stick
Yes,
to
could
it.
have been a
Yeah.
Matty,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but we don't know whether they called her Matty.
Or
Yeah.
Tilda is
Tilda,
one
yes.
that they use a lot these days, don't
Yeah.
they, with Matilda? They
Yeah.
shortened it to
Yeah.
Tilda.
Absolutely. So that's why she turned up as Jeanette.
And to be honest, they must have used diminutives, because you have generations of the same family with the same name.
Yes.
You've got to distinguish, when you're shouting them to the dinner table, you've got to distinguish between them somehow.
Yes, I think that's where, well, we know that younger children had kin or et put on their names.
Yeah.
So, and you still get that today. So you get like Little John is Jenkins.
Yeah.
Jenkin, which of course has become a surname.
Yeah. Now, central to the early part, well, a lot of this story is the marriage between Jeanette and Thomas. Did you ever doubt that they were actually married?
No, I think they were married from the start, because you're not going to fight for 9 years to get that marriage recognised, and the struggle they had to get that marriage recognised in the end made me think that yes, it was actually a love match. So no, I never doubted it. And when you see, which I've read, the papal documents, or I read an essay on the papal documents, which gives papal documents at the back of the essay, you can see that it was quite a convoluted case, but throughout it, they were both determined that they had been married. And her Jeanette's second marriage family did their damnedest to stop it going through, even to the point of locking her up and refusing to let her talk to lawyers and priests.
That was the Montague family, William Montague's family. Yeah,
that was the Montague family. Yes, they locked her up and wouldn't let her talk to a lawyer.
Yeah, it's actually an incredible that whole bit of it is an incredible story, really, in itself, isn't it?
Yes, there are all sorts of conundrums and things you think, why? When we'll never know, because the people who don't know, I'll call her Joan of Kent, because a lot of people will know her as Joan of Kent. They can read her as Jeanette in the novel. Joan of Kent, as a very young girl, married one of the king's household knights, Thomas Holland, in secret. The marriage was consummated, according to Thomas Holland and to Jeanette. I've called her Jeanette there, haven't I? I'll interchange her.
We know who you mean.
Yeah, well, you know who I. Yes, yeah.
We know.
And the marriage was consummated, but then suddenly he went away for a year on crusade. Why did he go away on crusade, having secretly married her? Nobody knows. Was it to atone for the sin, to get out himself out of trouble, to have a cooling off period after the? We don't know. But during that year, her mother and the Salisbury family, the Montagues, arranged a marriage between her and their eldest son William. And Joan went through with it, and said later that she went through with it because she was scared, and she thought something horrible would happen if she refused. So she was coerced into this marriage to William Montague, who was only 13 years old. And then Thomas returned from crusade, and there's his wife with the Montagues. And he didn't actually do anything for a few years, and then suddenly but basically he had no money to fight this case, and everybody appeared to be on the Montague side at the time. But then he suddenly, during the Hundred Years' War and a battle campaign, he won a large ransom that allowed him the money to pursue his case for Joan through the courts, which is when her family locked her up. But the interesting thing is that this ransom, the ransoms were sort of taken by the knights and then they were given to the king or the Black Prince to broker them.
Mm.
And when he handed over, it was Raoul de Brienne, who was an important Frenchman that he'd captured. He'd saved his life. When the ransom came through a few months later, the king agreed to pay him 80,000 Italian florins. Or was it 800,000? Gosh. It was a huge sum of Italian florins for this man, way beyond what you'd expect for a ransom, even for a count. It was huge. It's like winning the lottery.
Mm.
Now, why, when there's been all this objection before to the to Thomas's marriage to Joan, does the king suddenly offer him this massive sum of money that enables him to go through and pursue this marriage? William Montagu grumbled, or the Montagu side grumbled about it, and the king tossed them some money. But it was like the difference between a McDonald's and a banquet. So what is going on?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't get that bit, but clearly something happened which meant that Thomas was given the money to go get Joan.
Could it be that the king was aware and was trying to pay him off? Or he obviously used the money to finance his court case, but I wonder whether the king intended that.
I don't know. There's all sorts. You could read it several different ways. But whatever it was, and I don't think Thomas ever got paid all the money, but just the I promised to pay at the outset was enough to allow him to go to Avignon, because of course the popes were split between Rome and Avignon at this stage, but enabled him to go to Avignon and pursue his case. But it still took him years. In Joan's case, several lawyers who were being nobbled by the Salisbury Montagues before he won. They won through, because I have to say because Joan refused to capitulate, and as I say, the Montagues kept locking her up to prevent her from testifying, and Thomas had to then go to Rome and say, my wife is locked up and they won't allow her to testify. Can you do something about it? So Rome then wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury and a couple of others and said, this is what's happening. She has to be allowed to testify. So the question, I think the original question was, did we ever doubt that they were married? No. They were in it for the long haul.
Yeah, the alternative is that they started having an affair after Thomas had come back off crusade and decided that this was the way to get a divorce, saying that she'd already been married to Thomas.
Yes.
But just the amount of hoops they had to go through, and also the fact they're dealing with a papal court, so they have to swear on their immortal souls that they're telling the truth.
Yeah.
And in the 14th century, that was a very big deal.
Absolutely. That's absolutely. And Thomas had the full support of his own mother, who went with him to Avignon, because we know from the papal records that she asked for a portable altar so that she could pray along the way. And when you start reading through into the family situations, you also that also helps to bolster the fact, I think, that it wasn't just about the money. And I don't think they did get together when he got back. He'd been injured as well. He came back minus the sight of one eye. So it wasn't an absolute bargain when he came back. So I think that they were married beforehand, and as you say, to swear on one's immortal soul, especially with the Black Death swirling around, because you knew you'd die at any time, that you knew that God was watching. Everyone was being exhorted by the priest to behave themselves and be good Christians, in the hopes that this horrible pestilence would go away. So there was also that extra tension upon it too.
And I think also they were very aware. In the book, you mentioned John de Warenne, the 7th and last Earl of Surrey, and his attempts to get divorced. So Thomas and Joan are very aware of the fact that it isn't smooth sailing and they might not get what they want because John de Warenne never did.
No, that's very true as well. So there were an awful lot of obstacles in their way. And Joan was still quite young. She was still probably in her teens. By the time they got around to winning their case, she would have been in her late teens, early 20s. So it's a formative period, and she'd gone through that, being stubbornly determined all the time. And Thomas himself knew he was incurring the wrath of some powerful and important people by standing up to that struggle. I never doubt they were married, and I don't think there was there is a claim that Thomas and Joan had an affair when he was her steward to her husband. I can't find any evidence of him ever having been steward to the Montagues. I think if it did happen, it probably happened during the Scottish Wars before the transference of the royal court to Ghent, to Flanders. I think it was very early in Tom's career because we know he was with them. He sometimes was with them, the older Earl of Salisbury. I think he perhaps served in the household there before transferring to the royal household and then to going to Flanders with them. So that's my take. It's a bit of a different timeline, but there is no evidence. There's one chronicle says he was a steward, but then when you try and look up the evidence, it's not there. You know, so one has to, as a person now, especially a novelist, is extrapolate from what you can find out.
Yeah.
So this is in the 1340s that you're writing, and there's a lot going on in the 1340s. War with France, the Black Death. Was it hard to keep your focus on the central story?
I just had to be disciplined. You've got a central story, which is like a river, a big river, and your characters are sailing on that river, and you're concerned with them and how all this impacts on them. And if you go off into elsewhere, you know, it's like rowing up tributaries to dead ends. So you just have to keep your focus on the river, on them. How is this affecting them? And then it becomes quite easy. Like we know Thomas went away on crusade to the Baltics. We know that he went off to the 100 Years' War. We know that to France. I've completely blanked the name of the battle.
Cressy.
Cressy, yes, I think so. Yeah, I don't feature Cressy that much at all. But he was involved as a commander in the 100 Years' War. So I can go with Thomas there and just see what he's doing. We know that he had to get this big ransom. How did he get this big ransom? And it was quite exciting how he actually obtained the ransom. So you can bring that in, and back at home, we find out what Joan was doing, like being locked up by Montagues and growing up a bit. And so you just look at how is it affecting them? The Black Death comes along. What do they think of it? So you can have their personal opinion of the Black Death. And then, of course, lots of their relations, both friends and enemies, died from the Black Death. So how does that affect it? You know, Catherine of Salisbury herself passed away from the Black Death. So it's you just bring all those into your character's experience, but never lose sight of the fact that it's how they're involved and how they feel. That's the important thing, and only put in as many as you know Bob moments as you need. As they are called, you know, info dumping.
Yes, quite.
Keep that info dumping to the absolute minimum. What does the reader really need to know? Not what you research and you think might need to go in. By the time you're at the last draft, it's what's the bottom line of the need to know for the average reader. And that's definitely a guiding principle, which I've come to understand as I've gone on in my career.
I did feel for Joan that her marital duty meant she had to stay with Montague. So she must have felt very relieved when he went off to war in France as well. But at the same time, that meant she was left with her mother-in-law and grandmother-in-law, who were worse than Montague.
I quite enjoyed writing them.
All the potions for getting pregnant, to try and get her pregnant and things like that. It was
yes, I mean that is authorial license but based on my
Mm.
alternative research.
But you know that they would have wanted her, the priority was always to have an heir and secure the lands for the future.
Yeah.
But I thought Joan, as a teenager, was very clever in saying, but if I do this now, if I get pregnant now, there will always be a question mark
Yes.
over the legitimacy of that child.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this happened because they got not over the Montagues, but later on with Richard II. When she married the Black Prince, she had to get a dispensation because they were related within the degree, but she also had to get a dispensation. It's a bit like a royalty renewal on a book when you went down, they give you a royalty refresher. You had to get a refresher from the Pope to say that the first marriage to Thomas Holland had been valid and the one to Montague hadn't. And that went into a chest of official family documents. And Richard II was very concerned to have that with him at all times. It was a precious thing because it proved his legitimacy. And he was accused of being born from an illegitimate line at one point. And he'd go, no, look, I've got the paperwork to show that it's all born because the Pope says so. So she had a very, very valid point, and people were it was one of their like get out or argument clauses in the Middle Ages. If an heir was legitimate or not, that they could make quite a meal out of it. If people wanted to dispute something, they could go, well, your mother slept with so and so, and I mean, I only know it very vaguely from distant general knowledge, but you get those accusations throughout the Wars of the Roses, don't you?
Yes.
Yes. So that's not my area. I just know it from sideline glancing.
Yeah, I think you'd have to had your head in the sand for a lot of years to not know anything about Edward IV, possibly having an earlier marriage. Only became to light when both the bride and the groom were dead.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes, I knew that one. Yes. Yeah.
Now, speaking of relationships, you imply a relationship between Edward III and Catherine of Salisbury, who, if I remember rightly, was Joan's mother-in-law. Do you think there was any truth behind that rumor of a relationship?
Yes, I do. I mean, I know other historians. Some historians will argue against it. Some will sit on the fence. The reasons I think so is that a French chronicle made some really big but rather silly accusations that Edward III raped Catherine of Salisbury while they were up in Scotland and left her so badly raped that she was bleeding on the floor. Now, this discourse is for a French audience who will lap this up. But is it a case of no smoke without fire? I mean, her husband was his best friend, so she moved in those circles. He would have known her well. She would have been a friend, definitely. So we can take that. But then when Catherine of Salisbury turns up again, as mentioned in the forming of the Knights of the Garter, both Joan and Catherine are linked with this story, which is apocryphal because a garter was a man's item of clothing. But apparently the lady's garter dropped off on the floor, and it's where the old "Honi soit qui mal y pense" comes from, to him who thinks evil of it. But the story gets attached to both Catherine of Salisbury and Joan of Kent. So here you have Catherine of Salisbury mentioned twice. Once in a slightly dodgy connotation that her garter fell off. The other one that he raped her. And Edward III's court was known for being licentious. I mean, he is reputed to have been totally faithful to his queen, Philippa of Hainault. Was he? I don't know. I think that's a thing that historians say without really looking into the background of it. The court was licentious. Do you have a licentious court and a chaste king who loves pageantry and tournaments and all sorts, where all sorts go on, and yet he stays back from it? His affair with Alice Perros began while his wife Philippa was still alive. She wasn't well, so he probably needed an outlet. She had something like 13 pregnancies, so there were times when she was unavailable to him. So I think that he probably did have the propensity to have other women. We can't say for sure because we don't know, and it's all circumstantial to do with Catherine of Salisbury. Another thing that just made me think, oh, that's interesting, and this could be absolutely nothing, is that when John of Gaunt's wife Constanza of Castile bore her daughter, the person he sent to tell the king of the birth was Catherine Swynford, who was by then his mistress. Now, when Queen Philippa had one of her children in Flanders, so it was either Lionel or John of Gaunt, I can't remember offhand which one, but one of those. Catherine of Salisbury was sent to tell the king. The king was over in England. Catherine of Salisbury went to tell him of the birth. So here you have a royal mistress in Catherine Swynford going to tell the king that the king's wife's had a child, and then you get Catherine of Salisbury going to tell Edward III that your wife's had a little boy. No, there could be nothing in that, but it might be an interesting thing for somebody of a studying historian to look up. Did royal mistresses get sent to give news of birth? There's two of them there in the same family.
Yeah, I guess it's an indication of a certain level of intimacy between the king and those women.
Definitely.
So you wouldn't just pick anybody to go and tell him such important news.
No, but to send, well, in John of Gaunt's case, to send your mistress with the news of your wife's delivery to your father is rather interesting. So Catherine of Salisbury went to Edward, who was abroad. I mean, and she could have popped across the channel and had a bit of nookie with him while she was across the channel. I don't know. Again, that's complete speculation. But I think what I can say is that there are grounds to think, or there are reasons to think that it's not entirely out of the window that Edward III and Catherine of Salisbury had an intimate relationship.
It's interesting that a French chronicler mentions it, but no English chroniclers. But then Edward was the epitome of chivalry, wasn't he? So
Yes.
the English would probably close their eyes to that kind of thing with Edward, whereas the French wouldn't because he's attacking them.
Yeah, I think so, and I think the chronicler has massively overdone it. So I think that Edward might have even that just be sort of been eyeing her up, and there may have been a bit of flirtation. I don't know. Her husband died in 1344. Perhaps they got together after that, as he was comforting the widow, and that it could have been a case of that.
So there's inverted commas around the comforting the widow.
Well, that's up to you. So it might not have started in Scotland. He might just have been flirting, but a French chronicler would have gone, "Oh, look, he's comforting our widow, and we can make mileage of this." And so, just like the tabloid press do today, the spin and twist goes on into the French version. But then, when you tie that into the Garter mention, it makes me wonder.
Yeah, especially with the Garter one. I mean, we know it didn't happen anyway because, like you say, women didn't wear garters. Well, if it did, that could be just read not as more of flirtation than anything else.
Then it could be. Yes, that's right. I do wonder if because it's a strange thing to have as a symbol of knighthood. So perhaps he was talking it over, or perhaps it's Catherine of Salisbury's idea. I don't know. She'd be the one taking his garters off.
What, a medieval woman with an idea? Goodness me, where will it end?
Tricky. They're very tricky.
Can't be having that.
So yeah, my view is no smoke without fire, and that we sometimes give Edward III too much of a pass when it comes to his interest in other women.
So did you encounter any difficulties when researching Jeanette and Holland's story?
Difficulties? Well, the usual difficulties of researching a historical novel, in that some of the secondary sources differ in their opinions, and you've got to work your way through. Is this just this is a personal opinion of that person, and it is likely that, and then something that they believe happened. So then you've got to go and dig underneath and think, well, do I think this is likely or do I not? So there's all that going on. It's finding that's the I would say is the main difficulty. Penny Lorne, who's one of Joan's biographers, disagrees with Anthony Goodman. This is in my later work. There's talk about that later. But they have completely different views on whether Edward III was happy that the Black Prince was going to marry Joan later on. And you find that people that they will say it is highly likely, or it is possible, it is probable, or not even, they'll just put it in, stated as a fact, and then you go and look at somebody else and they'll say no, and then you have to work your way through and think, well, it's just an opinion. So you've either got to dig back you've got to dig back and find out what you think about the situation. So that was one of the difficulties, and also finding out. Sometimes you could not find something out at all. Thomas went off on crusade, but we don't know, and came back minus an eye, but we don't know anything about his time out there. So, I invented a little scenario for him for his eye loss, but we don't know what happened.
But you've got shadows of William Marshall there, haven't you? What happens on crusade stays on crusade.
It stays on crusade, absolutely. And even more shadows of William Marshall, and his father John lost an eye, and one of the things I did come across, and I just could not put it in, so this is an omission, is that there is a mention, I think it's by Froissart, who is a chronicler of the time, who tells a fantastic story, but you can't trust him. He's a very, very good storyteller, and some of the time he tells the truth, and some of the time he elaborates, or exaggerates, or doesn't tell the truth. You've got to work your way through. So, but he mentions that the Catherine of Salisbury's husband, William, lost an eye, and then you have Thomas, who lost an eye. And you can't just have these two men wandering about one-eyed looking. Since one of them's got to have two eyes, you can't just have all these one-eyed men having conversation.
Don't have everybody losing an eye.
A nod isn't as good as a wink.
No, quite.
It was only one mention, and I thought, well, losing an eye, it can mean various things. Sometimes they'll have, a cuckold might be mentioned as having lost an eye, which I thought, oh, interesting. So those were little minor difficulties that I came across while researching. The only other thing was that you find that Joan is mentioned as having a sister called Margaret, and there really wasn't time for her parents to pop out another child in the time they were married. And you think, well, where does Margaret fit in? Was she a twin? And then I found an answer from Penny Lawn, who said that it's a typo. The clerk was having a Friday afternoon moment, and instead of writing Joan, wrote her mother's name, Margaret, in the place. So suddenly this Margaret turns up in one place, never again to be mentioned, in a marriage setup. And she doesn't appear in anywhere else except this one place. So Penny Lawn's opinion is that, well, it's a typo. So Joan became Margaret and then created this whole other person who didn't exist.
We've all done it.
But that's a problem. If you can't dig it out because it's just in one place. So you have to go with what appears to be the obvious, but have to think about it first.
I think the thing is, as a writer now, you can really easily understand how easy it is to transpose a name.
Definitely, I've done it in the past. Yes. I do things all the time, and if you don't catch them in an edit, then oops.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The scope for chaos is huge.
Yes, and the scribe might have gone, oh, bummer, it's Friday afternoon, I'm not getting the goat tooth out now.
And I'm not wasting another piece of parchment.
Yes.
You mentioned briefly there Joan's age. Obviously, it's a fairly constant feature of medieval life that girls were married very young. Many believe that Joan was only 12 when she secretly married Holland. This is something which today is obviously, in our current climate, is regarded as very, very suspect and somewhat odd and worse than odd. So how do you write about it with an eye to modern sensitivity and yet remain historically accurate? How do you square that circle?
How do I square the circle? Well, I think Joan was slightly older. It still doesn't make it wonderful, but slightly older than 12 That was where I got the Catherine Warner thing from, where she points out nobody knows the birth order. And if you put, it's nowhere written down what the birth order is, and there is sort of circumstantial evidence to say it's earlier rather than later. And especially if you take this Margaret out of the equation too. So she could well have been the firstborn child, which would put her at 14, not 12. That still doesn't make it sort of right, if you like, for a modern personality. Might still think that's a bit dodgy. So you just have to go, I think, with writing the medieval mindset and portray that medieval mindset through their thoughts so that it's okay with them, and their mindset of how, why, where, what, because, you know, her second husband, William Montagu, was 13. So he was possibly, by that time, a couple of years younger than she was when they married. The medieval age of consent was 12 for a girl and 14 for a boy. And
I wonder if that's where they got her age from. Because she wasn't married yet, then she must have been under 12.
Yes. I mean, she was having this marriage arranged with the Gascon noble, and it all fell through around the time that she was at the court, before the children of the court moved back to England. And there were this marriage, for whatever reason, fell through. I've forgotten his name, Armand d'Albret, and it didn't happen. And it was around that time she had her fling with Thomas. Not her fling, her and Thomas secretly married. Perhaps it was to get out of this other marriage. I don't know. That's another possibility on the radar. The king tried again with his daughter Isabel many years later to try and get her married to this man, and Isabel point blank refused. But perhaps the girls knew something. Isabel was a contemporary of Joan's, and you know, perhaps the girls knew something that made them decided they weren't going to marry this man, whatever. It is a possibility. I don't know. So for squaring the circle, you just have to go with the mindset of the time, and work as best you can, and hope that readers who come over walk over the bridge you've created into the past get it.
And you also have to think, what 13 or 14-year-old girl wouldn't fall head over heels with a dashing soldier?
Yes, I think so. I think when we think back, I don't know whether it still happens today these days, but you know, the crushes on boy band members, and you have a poster up on your wall, or you know, your breathing would, and your stomach would lurch, and you'd sort of fixate on this person. And you know, run away to greater rock concerts and things. So it's so I think that's part of Joan's mindset. She's got her eye on him, and in the end he yielded to temptation probably, but then did the decent thing, and then the decent thing turned out to cause an awful lot of trouble. But they didn't grow apart. They grew together, even while being separated by circumstance. They grew together and were determined to keep together.
I think it just shows how incredibly strong their bond must have been, because the amount of trouble they had to go through to be together would have broken most couples.
I think so. I think it was 9 years, give or take, between their marriage and they're finally being allowed to live together. And as husband and wife, they had to marry again in front of the court when they got the dispensation to say that yes, that first marriage was legitimate. And so it was 9 years of her being coerced, shut up, you know, both literally and, you know, locked up, told not to speak, you know, and yet she refused to give in to pressure. She could have had a wonderful life. She could have just given in to the pressure, pretended it never happened, and lived a life with William Montagu. And Thomas Holland might have, I suppose, could have kicked up a stink, which he did anyway, but it could have all just gone under the radar and nobody would ever have known.
Yeah, if Joan had just turned around and said, no, he's lying,
yeah,
then that would have been the end of it. He couldn't have done anything.
And if the king could have just, said, well, I'm not giving you this ransom, or you could have, 50p, or whatever. But instead gave him all this money.
Yeah. And they went on to have, was it 5 children together?
I think it was sort of some people say 5, but there are four that survived. 2 boys born within a year. The first one born 9 months after their official reunion, Thomas. Then John another couple of years later, and then 2 girls, Matilda and Joan.
Yeah.
And that's right. And she went with him on battle campaigns. Not all the time. Sometimes she stayed at home, but sometimes she went on tour with him. And they like sending the children to boarding school. They left the children behind with relatives sometimes. So she would go and she would be alone with, run his household, I suppose. But she would just go with her husband and leave the kids with a relative and go on his tour of duty with him.
After spending 9 years of being forced apart, it makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. Yes. I mean, people go, oh well, it was because after Thomas passed away, she married within the same year that he passed, and was engaged within 3 months of his passing. And but that's typical for the medieval period. If you're a beautiful, fertile young widow, then right, you're straight back in harness, and and it's like, who am I going to choose?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I had a reader once who said, well, why did she put up with this? Why, and you're thinking, well, that's how life was, and it was accepted. It wasn't something that was unusual that was thrust upon this woman. It was just what happened, and that women sort of not bought into, but accepted that was how things work.
Exactly. Yeah.
Especially when they had titles on lands that were theirs.
Yes.
Joan was the Countess of Kent in her own right. She wasn't going to stay single. She had to marry quickly in order to control her life. She had, if she was going to have any chance of choosing her husband, she had to do it quickly before one was forced on her.
Yep. She was the richest woman or one of the richest women in the country. Had a lot of money. And so everybody would be throwing their cap in the ring. But you choose the man who's loved you all your life, who gives you a silver cup with your name on it.
Yeah. And while you are, I've written about several widows who have got kidnapped and been forced into marriage.
Yes.
So
yes.
if you marry quickly, then and choose someone like, she didn't exactly marry down, did she? Edward and Black Prince.
No, that's right. So I feel that the bond with her and Thomas Holland was a true love match.
Yeah, because he was the one she chose to be buried with as well.
Exactly. Yes. It's pity their tombs haven't survived the Reformation. Isn't it? But
every time I drive through Stamford, I just go, oh.
Oh yes, yeah. Because people, because so as you know, I like to write a love story into my novels, but I hope they're never fluffy.
Yeah.
So this was a love story, but it I don't go for hearts and flowers.
No, quite.
It's real life.
No, it definitely felt like real life, but it is perfect. Like, it must have captured Europe at the time that it was happening. This lowly knight trying to fight an earl through the courts to get his wife back.
Yes, I think there will probably be a lot of people grumbling about it and disapproval. I think some will be going, "Oh, look! Oh, isn't that wonderful?" And the hearts and flowersy ones.
Yeah.
But others will be going, "Gosh, disgraceful, that girl." She was known as the Fair Maid of Kent, and I think some of that was sarcastic.
Yes.
No better than she ought to be. And she did later on get castigated by the Constable of Brittany for her plunging necklines. I think she got a good bosom herself. Well, it was for her dress. She said that she was dressing like a mercenary's tart. because his wife was being plain and sober and sort of dressed in how a woman ought to be dressed, and then along comes the Princess of Aquitaine dressed like a mercenary's harlot. But clearly Edward, the Black Prince, didn't disapprove.
So, I'm guessing that the Constable of Brittany didn't actually disapprove. He was probably just jealous.
Yes.
How dare Edward have this glamorous wife while mine's dowdy?
But I guess it's kind of another indication of that she was her own woman as far as she could be, isn't it?
Yes. Well, fashion was everything. When you look at the tons of stuff that the aristocracy had to drag around,
Yeah.
I was astonished reading up on. I think I got a book called High Fashion in the Age of the Black Prince, and when you look at the tonnage of pearls and gold or imitation gold buttons and stuff, the bling they just wanted. You know, a hood with 300 pearls on it for the Black Prince. At one point, there was a shortage of pearls. Seriously, they couldn't get hold of the pearls to stitch them all on the clothes. You know, you used to rattle as you walked. You know, but bearing the weight of that for hours on end, they must just have sort of sat there like dollies some of the time. You know, when you get to a banquet,
I can only wear this for 2 hours and then I've got to get it off.
Yes. So when Philippa of Hainault, supposedly she had a bad fall from a horse and broke I think her shoulder blade. Was one of the reasons that she became poor. She had other things going on, I think. But when I think of her having to attend banquets and things, and you see the robes they were putting on her, it's a bit like wearing a lead apron. So, well, I'm glad those fashions have
me too.
gone. I mean, not that we'd have worn them.
But can you imagine driving in a long dress? Or getting on the bus?
Yes.
So, Elizabeth, Holland or Montague, who would you have chosen?
I would have chosen Holland. I don't dislike Montague. I think he grew up. He became a nice, ordinary man. Holland, I think, had charisma, and he was a strong battle commander. He was a really good military tactician, and he governed Brittany for a while. He had a good brain. He was a champion jouster. He'd obviously got all the physical attributes, which is nice, apart from losing an eye. But and that determination to go on for 10 years and to mend his family's reputation, because his father had been a traitor and been executed for it. So I think, a man of standing, of determination. Obviously, Joan saw a lot in him to fight for him. So I think I'd probably go with Thomas Holland, but with no detriment to Montague, who made a good marriage in the end and was always there as a decent chap in the background. And there's a lot to be said for decent chaps. At the time of his marriage with Joan, he was still a very young man, and with his mother and grandmother on the scene, especially after his father died, I think that he was probably well under the thumb at that stage in his life, and it was only later on that he came into his own.
It's one of these things that's rarely considered. He's a teenager. He's 13 or 14.
Yes.
And a married man, but he hasn't got access to his own lands and money. He's a married man. He could have had a family.
Yeah.
But his mother or whoever was his guardian would have controlled the purse strings.
Yes, that's right. It's part of the reason the young king rebelled against Henry II was having a household and not having responsibilities. So yes, you're in one way, yes, you're old enough to be married, but you are controlled by others until you reach your 20s. And so that must have been, well, no, if I say it must have been odd, I'm looking at it from a modern viewpoint. So I mustn't look at it from a modern viewpoint.
I think the thing is, these days, when we look at it, it's odd, because these days, if somebody has a child at 16, they're told, well, if you're old enough to have a child, then you're old enough to have the responsibilities of a child. Whereas in medieval times, yes, you're old enough to
You've
marry,
got to
but
be
you're not old
allowed.
enough to have the responsibilities of a husband.
Absolutely. So I don't actually know what age he got given his lands. I remember one of the martial lot at by gods, Vigo, as it should be said. He was given his earldom 2 years early. He was 19 when he got his earldom, and it was seen as
Yeah.
a special favour to him. Oh, well, you're old enough. You're 19 now. You can have your lands.
Yeah, John de Warenne was 20.
Yes.
It's supposed to be 21, but they did tend to get them a little earlier if they could prove they were responsible, I
Yes, that's right.
suppose.
Yes, but it's still, when he married at 13. To Joan, and then she wasn't much older, so they were both under the responsibility, especially after his father died in 1344, of the women of the household. I didn't find any sign that there was a particular person assigned to be a guardian. Catherine of Salisbury certainly didn't remarry, although she was of childbearing age still.
So maybe because she was so friendly with the king, she got the wardship.
Well, exactly, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. When you are widowed, you don't know who's going to but your new husband. You still might not have your children with you because they might get given to someone else. You just don't know.
Yeah. And you could be marrying somebody who's already got half a dozen children from a previous marriage, which is not unusual. So it's quite a thing. So what are you working on now then? What's your current project?
Well, I'm editing on a follow-up of Joan's story, because she's a story of two parts. In that she had a happy marriage with Thomas Holland, but when Thomas passed away, Joan was still young enough to have children, and as we've said, a very wealthy Countess of Kent. So she was on the marriage market again, and she married the heir to the throne, the Black Prince, the one who'd given her the silver cup with her name on it, who I think, we know he loved her very much. He loved her dearly. He writes letters to her calling her his treasure and his dearest heart. And so it's the story of that relationship, and also of mistresses. So we have Alice Perrers, the old king's mistress, coming into it, and the decline of a great king. So all that's going on. I didn't manage to get the Peasants' Revolt in because it would have been 200 pages longer, and my publisher would have fainted. So I think I'm leaving that for the next novel, because I've got a 3-book contract, which will be John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford.
Oh, right, yeah.
But Joan did know Catherine Swynford, so Joan can come into it, and a bit on that in there. So, but it's to look at the Joan up to the coronation of her son, Richard II.
I do love that in The Royal Rebel you hint at Edward being slightly in love with Jeanette throughout the book. There's little mentions of it.
Sure, yes.
And it's like, yeah, I like that.
I think he definitely was, because writing letters to his treasure and his dear heart, giving her this silver cup, and he stayed in contact. I mean, yes, he was definitely a friend. I mean, in that he was godfather to her first son, if not her second. He gave them gifts. There were more cups and things coming over. I don't think he was jealous of Thomas Holland, perhaps a bit envious, but not to a point of being an enemy. It's a bit like the song by Rick Springfield, Jessie's Girl. I wish I had Jessie's Girl. Where do I find a woman like that? And then suddenly, oh, the coast is clear.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Because he knows, the Black Prince knows, or would have known, that he was supposed to make a political match anyway. So he knew Joan wasn't the person for him when she was married to Holland.
No.
It wasn't a possibility anyway.
No, it wasn't. I mean, he might have approached her as a mistress, but I think he knew that her heart had Holland stamped through it like rock, And his father was busy organising marriages right, left and centre that kept falling through, foreign marriages. So when the opportunity came, he took it. Now, Anthony Goodman and Penny Lorne, biographers of Joan, have, I think it's those two. I could be misquoting actually, but there's definitely somebody who's written about Joan, who considers that Edward III was very disapproving of the match with his son, and that the other biographer says that it was one of the best things since sliced bread. I think it's Penny Lawn says it's the best thing since sliced bread. The other person, possibly Anthony Goodman, says that it wasn't, and that the king had to be brought around. So that's where I have to make a judgment choice, because it's pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
It's pretty different to yes, no, which way you go, with two good, both biographies, which whether it was Goodman or not, were very good, well written, and believable. So that is a problem, as you asked earlier, when you have two believable sources, which one do you go with? And then the author has to decide, and that affects the course of the whole novel.
Ooh, I can't wait to hear which one you decide. Don't tell me now.
I won't. I'm not because I'm. Yeah.
What if you change your mind? Once you've decided, you have to go with that, don't you? Otherwise, the entire story changes. So you can't change your mind.
Yeah, you'd have to go back and rewrite. I didn't change my mind, because actually the more I worked on the novel, the more it became pretty obvious which direction I was taking, from hints and circumstantial evidence about relationships. I just thought, yeah. And then I got one in the no box. I got one tick. I got 4 yes ticks and 1 no tick. And I thought, but that no tick could have altered over time down the years. So the no tick became more neutral then.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's been wonderful talking to you, as always. Do we have a title yet for the next book?
We don't have a title for the next book. Well, we cudgeled our brains over the Royal Rebel, because nobody could agree at the outset. And then we finally came up with that. And I said, well, I don't want it to sound too much, pot boilerish. And so, but my editor said, don't worry, we'll have a really good image on the cover. And it all pulled together really well, and I was really pleased with it. So we will have a brainstorm. At the moment, it's just called Jeanette Book 2. We might perhaps try and bring the silver cup into it, but it's silver cup might sound a bit fantasy. So we will be brainstorming after March.
Well, I look forward to reading Jeanette Book 2. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you for being our first guest of 2025. I hope you have a wonderful year.
Thank you for inviting me.
And hopefully we'll have you back again soon.
And Happy New Year.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Right, thanks. Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks so much for Elizabeth.
Bye.
Bye. Do join us next time when Derek and I are going to look into how great was King Canute. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks again for listening. If you liked what you heard, it'd be great if you could leave us a review. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to follow the podcast. Thanks for listening.